At least I know I raised one child worth being proud of. My mother said it with her wine glass already halfway to her lips, voice carrying across the entire back deck like she'd been saving the sentence for exactly this moment. 23 relatives went quiet. The kind of quiet where everyone stops chewing at the same time. I was standing by the railing with a glass of sparkling water I hadn't touched, still wearing my work jacket because I'd driven straight from the hospital after a 14-hour shift. My sister Petra was beside my mother, laughing at something our uncle had just said. Her hair done, her dress pressed, her life arranged exactly the way my mother had always imagined a daughter's life should look. Regional manager of a pharmaceutical distribution company, husband who coached minor hockey, 2 kids whose school photos my mother kept in a frame on the mantel in the living room. My mother turned her eyes toward me and pressed each word down slow, like a thumb into unset cement. 41 years old, working nights in some government clinic, no husband, no family of her own. She paused just long enough to make sure everyone was listening. You know what they call that in her field? A case study. 23 people laughed, not nervous laughter, permission laughter. The kind that only comes when the matriarch goes first and the rest follow because disagreeing would cost too much. I didn't move, didn't set my glass down, didn't blink. I looked straight into my mother's face, past the lipstick, past the champagne flush, past 41 years of her deciding what I was, and I said a single word. Clearwater. At the picnic table behind me, a folding chair scraped hard against the deckboards. My father's oldest friend, a man named Owen Mackay, 71 years old, had gone the color of old chalk. He'd been a flight nurse in the Canadian Forces for 26 years. His hands, still thick and steady enough to start a lawnmower in January, were shaking badly enough that his beer bottle knocked against the arm of the chair when he set it down. His voice came out raw like gravel pulled across asphalt. Stop. His eyes were fixed on me and nothing else in the world seemed to exist for him. Dear God, Clearwater. And then, in front of my mother, in front of the 23 people who had just been laughing at her joke, Owen Mackay pressed both hands flat on the table, pushed himself to his feet, and stood at full attention. His right hand rose to his brow in a salute that was slow, deliberate, and absolute. The laughter stopped where it stood. But before I tell you what happened that night, and what Clearwater meant to a man who'd seen combat and still went pale at the sound of it, make sure you subscribe to this channel, because what came next? Not one person on that deck saw it coming. Owen lowered his hand. He turned to face my mother, and there was nothing deferential in his eyes. No softness that a guest owes a host. He reached into the inside pocket of his fleece vest and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Not newspaper clippings this time, a printout from a medical journal, already yellowed at the folds from being opened and reread too many times. He unfolded it carefully and laid it on the picnic table. Your daughter, he said, voice still rough, built the protocol that's keeping people alive in remote communities across 3 provinces, without her name on it anywhere, because the government filed it under departmental research and she let them, because she didn't care about the credit. She cared about the people. The laughter hadn't fully died. It had simply frozen in place. 23 people stood on my mother's back deck in Barrie, Ontario, knowing less about their own blood than a 71-year-old with a folded piece of paper and shaking hands. I said nothing. I placed my glass on the railing and stood completely still. My eyes moved across the deck on instinct. Who was already reaching for their phone? Who was watching my mother's face for instructions on how to react? Who was going to be the first to find an exit? My cousin Derek had his eyes on his shoes like they owed him an explanation. My sister Petra had her wine glass raised halfway to her mouth and wasn't drinking, just holding it there, suspended thumb tight around the stem. My mother recovered first. She always did. Her voice dropped into the gentle, explanatory tone she used when she thought she was being patient. Owen, I hear you. I do. But you have to understand that Nadia has always had a tendency to make her work sound more significant than it is. Even as a girl, she lived in her own world. A small, sympathetic laugh moved through the crowd like a wave. Petra added her line with surgical timing. Brow furrowed in manufactured concern, she tilted her head in my direction. Are you okay? You look exhausted. Is everything all right? The question was engineered to the syllable. It moved me from someone who had just received a military salute to someone who needed to be checked on. Not accomplished. Unwell. It was the cleanest kind of gaslighting there is. They didn't argue with Owen. They redirected toward my mental state, because if I seemed fragile, nothing he'd said could hold its shape. I placed my glass on the railing. 4 seconds hold. 4 seconds. Out. Something from Micah that I don't recite so much as feel. What does the Lord require of you? Justice and mercy and walking humbly. I crossed the deck, shook Owen's hand, short, firm, eye to eye. Thank you for being here, Warrant Officer Mackay. Just enough for anyone paying attention to know I knew his rank. I'd always known. Owen leaned close, his voice low enough that only I could hear. The Lacombe inquest reopened last month. External review panel. They're taking testimonies until Friday. One breath. I nodded once. The rest of the evening, I don't need to describe in detail. The party scattered the way parties do when something real has intruded on an occasion that was only designed to hold comfortable things. I helped clear dishes. I said goodnight to my aunt. I drove back to my apartment in my 12-year-old Civic with the broken passenger side window crank, and I sat in the parking garage for a long time, with my hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2. On the passenger seat was a cardigan my mother had left in my car the last time I'd driven her to a medical appointment. I'd kept meaning to return it. I looked at it for a moment, then looked away. The memories didn't come in order. They came the way pain comes when the adrenaline finally drops. In pieces. In cold flashes. The year I was accepted into the health sciences program at McMaster, my mother didn't ask for the convocation date. She didn't come. She told people I was studying something medical when they asked, the same vague shrug she'd used to describe a minor household renovation. The year Petra was promoted to senior account manager, my mother organized a dinner at the Keg, reserved 12 weeks out, printed a card, called everyone individually. The year I published my first paper on triage protocol in underserved rural communities, my mother put the printed copy I'd mailed her in the recycling. I know because my aunt mentioned it without knowing she was telling me something I wasn't supposed to hear. The year Petra got a new car, my mother posted a photo on Facebook. Caption, so proud of this one. No hashtags needed. Not once. Not twice. Not a coincidence. A system. Maintained with the precision of something that had been decided long before I was old enough to prove anything. The sharpest memory. I was 19, standing in my mother's kitchen telling her I'd been offered a research placement at a public health agency in Ottawa. A paid placement. A real one. She didn't get angry. She got sorry for me. Her voice went gentle, patient, almost sweet. Nadia. That kind of work is for people who couldn't get into medical school. It's not a real career. It's a consolation prize. Not an insult. A verdict. Delivered calmly, by someone who believed she was telling me something I needed to know before I embarrassed myself further. Petra was at the kitchen table doing her nails and didn't look up from the cotton pad in her hand. I drove home from my mother's deck that night and I didn't cry. I'd stopped expecting myself to cry about it somewhere around 34. What I did instead was sit in the parking garage and remember Lacombe, Northern Alberta, February, -38 with wind chill and a storm system that had knocked out cell service across 400 square kilometers. I was 36, 4 years into a contract with Health Canada's Northern Community Support Program. The kind of posting that doesn't look impressive on a business card but puts you 6 hours by road from the nearest trauma center, with a satellite phone, a medical kit, and 17 communities depending on whoever you are. There was an outbreak, not dramatic the way outbreaks look in movies. Quiet, systemic, a respiratory illness, moving through a Métis community of 300 people, hitting the elders hardest, and a medical supply chain that had been flagged as inadequate in 3 consecutive annual reports that no one with authority had bothered to read. I put in the emergency supply request through standard channels at 6 in the morning. By noon, I'd received an auto-acknowledgement. By 3, I understood the auto-acknowledgement was the end of the process, not the beginning. I called my program supervisor, a man named Hargrove, who ran everything from a heated office in Edmonton. He listened. He said the procurement timeline was what it was. He said I should document everything carefully. He said he'd flag it for the weekly review call. I had 3 elders who were septic. I had medication that would run out before the weekly review call. I called in every favor I had. I contacted a pharmacist in Grande Prairie who agreed to release emergency stock under a compassionate use authorization. I drafted myself at midnight using guidance from a Health Canada circular that technically applied to different circumstances. I contacted a bush pilot named Doris Garreau who flew the supplies in at her own cost through a storm system that grounded every other aircraft in the region. I stayed on the phone with her the entire flight, tracking her on a paper map with a pen because the satellite tracker had gone dark. 3 elders survived that week who statistically should not have. A 12-year-old girl named only in my notes, because I don't use patient names, went home to her family. What happened next was not a commendation. Within 3 weeks of the Lacombe intervention, my program supervisor filed an incident report characterizing my procurement actions as a breach of protocol. Unauthorized use of emergency authorization frameworks, potential liability exposure for the department. Every word was drafted to make me sound like the problem, not the storm, not the supply chain, not the 3 consecutive reports that no one had read. An anonymous tip went to a health policy reporter at a national paper. The story that ran described a government health worker who had gone outside proper channels and created significant procurement irregularities in a remote northern community. Nobody printed the part about 3 elders going home. Nobody called Doris Garreau. I called my mother that week, the only time in my adult life I called her crying. Not as a professional or a researcher or a daughter who'd learned to manage her own expectations. Just as a person sitting on the edge of a cot in a community health center, 6 hours from anyone who was supposed to love me, asking the woman who'd given birth to me to say 3 words. I believe you. She listened to everything. I told her about the storm, about the elders, about the procurement file, about the article, about Hargrove. She listened without interrupting, and for one moment I thought, maybe this is the thing. Maybe this is what finally cracks through. Maybe hearing your child's voice break at the end of a phone line is the sound that overrides everything else. She waited until I stopped. Then she spoke. Her voice was flat, almost bored. I told you government work wasn't a real career. You should have gone into something stable. Then she hung up. I held the phone against my ear for 9 more seconds. I know because the clock on the wall across from the cot had a second hand, and I watched it move before I understood she was gone. That she had always, in the ways that mattered, been gone. 2 days later, I received an email from my then partner, a man I'd been with for 4 years. He didn't ask whether I was safe. He didn't ask what had happened in Lacombe. He said he'd seen the article, and he needed to understand the legal exposure before we could talk about anything else. He said he had a government contract of his own that he couldn't afford to have complicated by association. He said he was sorry. What he meant was that he was sorry this was inconvenient for him. The person who held the line was my senior colleague at the Indigenous Health Partnerships Office, a woman named Dr. Ama Asante, who had been fighting the same procurement bureaucracy from a different angle for 11 years. She didn't comfort me with softness. She called me from her own phone at 7 in the morning and said, "Don't resign, don't apologize, don't let them make this your error to carry. Stay in the room. The truth doesn't expire. It just needs someone with enough patience to keep it alive until the room is ready to hear it." She helped me draft a formal response to the incident report. She connected me with a public health lawyer who reviewed the procurement authorization and confirmed it fell within the regulatory framework narrowly, but within it. She made sure I was transferred to a different program before Hargrove could do anything further. I opened my eyes in the parking garage. 4 years had passed since Lacombe. 4 years since the article. 4 years since the phone call that ended without goodbye. My mother had not once, in a card or a call or a text or a Christmas dinner, asked what had happened up there, had not asked whether the elders had recovered, had not asked what it had cost me, had not asked whether I had been all right. But Owen Mackay had kept the journal printout. Dr. Asante had kept her word. And the young man who had coordinated the emergency medical transport that night, now working as a program officer in Ottawa, sent me a message every year on the anniversary of the Lacombe intervention. Just a single line. Still here because of that week. The inquest had reopened. The following morning, I drove to Barrie to pick up a casserole dish I'd lent my aunt 6 months ago that she kept forgetting to return. My mother's car was in the driveway. I parked on the street. I was lifting the dish out of my aunt's trunk when my mother appeared from the side gate. She was wearing her weekend clothes, hair not yet done. She was carrying a tin, the same blue tin she used every Christmas, the same shortbread she baked exclusively for Petra's birthday every February, the recipe she'd gotten from her own mother, the one she had never once made for me. She held it out with both hands. Her voice had none of the sharpness from the night before, none of the razored precision. "Nadia, I brought these for you. I was thinking you could take them for your colleagues." I looked at the tin. I understood exactly what it was. Not a gesture of love, a tool. The only one she had left once logic failed and denial had nowhere further to go. Offer food, smooth the surface. Restore a version of things where she had not publicly humiliated me in front of 23 people and been corrected by a man she'd known for 30 years. "I don't need them," I said. My voice didn't rise or fall. She didn't leave. Leaving would mean accepting that the tin hadn't fixed it. "Owen means well," she said, shifting into the explanatory register. "But you know how he gets about the old days. He gets emotional. His memory isn't always reliable. I'm not saying he's lying. I'm saying he remembers things the way he wants them to have been." Gaslighting delivered by a woman who had never spent a single night farther north than Sudbury. I watched her face. Read it the way I'd learned to read situations where the official version and the real version were operating simultaneously. Jaw muscle working just slightly. Eyes checking the front window every few seconds to see whether my aunt was watching. This wasn't a private moment between a mother and a daughter. This was reputation management, performed for an audience of one, with options being held in reserve. Petra appeared from around the same gate, phone in hand, the way she always appeared, just slightly too quickly for it to be accidental. She tilted her head. "Are you doing okay? Honestly? We worry about you. You've always been so isolated, you don't let people in." The question was precision engineered. Reframe the decorated professional as the emotionally unavailable one. Make the salute look like a symptom of my inability to form normal relationships rather than evidence of something real and hard-won. I looked at my sister. For the first time all morning, I let my face go completely still. Not cold, not angry, simply present in a way that let her know I had read every sentence she'd written. "Mum, Petra." I kept my voice low and level. "I'm not going to do this today. Not because I don't have anything to say. Because what I need to say isn't meant for a driveway. My mother opened her mouth. I continued before she found the first word. Owen doesn't misremember, and I'm not isolated. I'm just not available to people who've never asked how I am without an agenda. I picked up the casserole dish. That's a distinction I figured out somewhere around year 35. I drove home. Window down despite the October chill, the kind of cold that has bite but not cruelty, the kind of Canadian autumn that smells like wet leaves and wood smoke and something ending cleanly. I thought about the inquest, about Hargrove, who had spent 4 years collecting consulting contracts from the same department that had filed the incident report, about the families in Lacombe who had submitted written testimony and been waiting since spring for a panel with enough authority to do something with it, about the fact that my name was still technically attached to a procurement irregularity that had never been formally resolved. The next morning, I called Dr. Asante before 7. She picked up on the second ring. I knew you'd call this week, she said. Her voice had the particular steadiness of someone who had been keeping score quietly for a very long time. I have the original authorization documentation, I said. The regulatory framework citation, the emergency compassionate use memo, the pilot logs from Doris Garreau. I have everything. Pause. Then, I have the 3 consecutive supply chain inadequacy reports that Hargrove signed off on and never escalated. I've had them for 2 years. Waiting. Another pause. Are you ready to give a statement? I looked at the casserole dish, washed and drying on my rack. The shortbread tin my mother had tried to hand me through a car window. Yes, I said. The inquest hearing was held in a government building in downtown Ottawa. Beige carpet, fluorescent lighting, the particular institutional smell of documents and coffee that has been warming too long in a glass pot, nothing like the Austin Banquet Hall, no chandeliers, no red carpet. I wore my Health Canada identification badge, clipped to my lapel, and carried a folder that held 4 years of documented evidence. I was the 3rd person scheduled to give testimony. Hargrove was in the hallway when I arrived. He'd lost some hair since Lacombe. He was wearing a suit that was slightly too formal for a government hearing room, the way people wear things when they need the costume to do work the confidence can't. He saw me, and his face went through several expressions in rapid sequence before settling on something that was trying to be professional courtesy and not quite getting there. Dr. Renner, he said, I didn't know you'd been called. I'm not here as a witness, I said. My voice was the voice of someone who had been waiting 4 years to be in exactly this room. I'm here as the person who filed the original emergency authorization. The panel asked for my documentation. He made a sound that wasn't quite a word. I walked past him to the check-in table. The panel was composed of 3 people: an independent health policy reviewer from the University of Toronto, a former First Nations health advocate who had been doing this work for 30 years, and a public accountability officer whose entire career had been built on exactly the intersection of government protocol and community harm. None of them were interested in being impressed. All of them were interested in the documentation. I gave my testimony in 40 minutes. I walked through the authorization framework, the regulatory basis, the supply chain failure that had predated the intervention by 4 documented years, and the specific clinical outcomes of the Lacombe week. I mentioned Doris Garreau by name. I mentioned the 12-year-old who went home. I mentioned the 3 elders. I did not mention my mother. When I finished, the panel chair looked at me over her reading glasses and said, "We've reviewed the procurement documentation. The authorization was narrow but defensible. We have questions for Mr. Hargrove." On the bench to my right, I saw Dr. Asante in the second row. She didn't smile. She gave a single, small nod, the nod of someone who had been keeping the file for exactly this moment. 3 rows behind her, I saw my mother. She had driven to Ottawa, taken the 400 to the 115 to the 401, 4.5 hours, and found the building and signed in as a member of the public and sat in the 3rd row of a government hearing room to watch. I hadn't told her the date. I hadn't told her the city. I didn't know how she'd found out. My aunt, probably. My aunt knew everything and meant well and couldn't keep a secret past Wednesday. My mother sat with her hands folded in her lap, coat still on, the way she sat when she was somewhere she wasn't sure she had permission to be. She'd seen the documentation. She'd heard the testimony. She'd heard the panel chair's response. She'd heard Doris Garreau's name. She'd heard about the 12-year-old. Her face was the face of someone being shown something that refuses to fit into the story they've been telling for 41 years. I didn't stop on my way out. I nodded to Dr. Asante. I shook hands with the panel administrator. I walked through the lobby and out into the Ottawa afternoon and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, just breathing the cold air, while the sound of the building I'd just left settled somewhere behind my sternum. My phone buzzed on the drive home. Petra. I watched the name move across the screen without answering. The text came 11 minutes later. "Mum is upset. Could you maybe have warned her?" This was a lot for her to take in. Not a question about the testimony. Not a word about Lacombe. Not a single syllable about the families or the elders or Doris Garreau flying through a storm. Just, Mum is upset. Could you have managed this better for her comfort? I set the phone face down on the passenger seat. That was the last answer I needed. Not a decision I was still weighing. A verdict that had been building since I was 19 years old in that kitchen, listening to my mother explain to me what a consolation prize looked like. 4 days after Ottawa, 3 knocks at my apartment door. Soft, tentative, the sound of a hand that wasn't sure it had the right. I checked. My mother stood in the hallway in her everyday coat, no makeup. Hair pulled back the way she wore it on Sunday mornings when she wasn't performing anything for anyone. In her hands, the blue tin. Not the casserole tin, the shortbread tin, the February birthday one. I opened the door but didn't step back. Stood in the frame, she looked smaller than I expected. Not physically. Something else. The particular compression of a person who has run out of the story they've been telling. Nadia. Her voice broke in the middle of my name. I didn't know. I'm sorry. I didn't know what you'd done up there. I looked at her for a long moment. Not warm, something closer to clear. You didn't know, I said, or you chose not to ask. She started to answer. I kept going. You had my number through 4 postings, 4 provinces, 4 years after the article ran. You never called to ask what really happened. You had the paper I mailed you, and you put it in the recycling. You heard Owen Mackay give me a military salute in your backyard, and your first instinct was to question his memory. She was crying now, not the composed tears of someone managing a room, the crying of someone who had run out of surface to stand on. She reached for my arm. I stepped back 1 pace, not dramatic, practical. I'm not doing this to punish you, I said. I'm doing it because I spent 41 years trying to be legible to you and you didn't want to read me. That's not something a tin of shortbread fixes. I know you made it to Ottawa. I know that cost you something. But showing up to watch me be believed by strangers isn't the same as believing me yourself. I'm trying, she said. I know, I said. But trying feels like a beginning when it should have started 30 years ago. I closed the door. The deadbolt turned. 1 clean, dry sound that was neither a punishment nor a release. Just the closing of a chapter whose last line had been written for years before I finally got around to reading it aloud. Petra called twice that week. I let both go to voicemail. Her texts were variations on the same request. Be softer, be more available, be less of whatever I was being that made things complicated for the people who hadn't done the work to understand me. I didn't respond to any of them. That same week, Owen called. Not about my mother, not about the inquest. Just his voice on the line, steady as a January morning. There's a peer support group I've been co-facilitating. Healthcare workers, mostly. People who've worked remote postings, northern communities, emergency environments. We meet Thursdays at a community center in Isnafil. Coffee and folding chairs. Nothing formal. You don't have to talk. I drove out the following Thursday in civvies. Toque pulled down. The kind of low profile that becomes a habit when you've spent years in environments where being noticed can go either way. The room was exactly what he'd said. 12 chairs in a loose circle. A coffee urn on a card table that had seen better decades. A box of Tim Hortons Timbits that someone had brought and no one had made a formal moment out of, which was exactly right. I took the seat nearest the door, full view of the room. Old habit, I hadn't planned to speak. I'd come because Owen had asked, and because Dr. Asante had said once, with the particular precision she used for things she meant seriously, that isolation doesn't protect you from anything, it just makes you carry everything without the relief of being witnessed. When the facilitator turned to me, I looked around the circle. I stopped at the corner chair. A young woman, maybe 28, in scrubs she hadn't changed out of, sitting folded in on herself the way a person sits when the weight of the week hasn't lifted yet. Her eyes were on the floor. Her shoulders were curved inward, like someone trying to take up less space than the chair they were sitting in. I recognized that posture the way you recognize your own handwriting on an envelope you didn't remember sending. I stood up. No notes. No prepared anything. The hardest part, I said, keeping my voice low, the voice of someone saying something true rather than something impressive. The hardest part isn't the crisis. It's coming home to people who don't understand what you carried there and slowly teaching yourself that their inability to understand it doesn't make it less real. The young woman lifted her eyes. I've heard of you, she said. Her voice was thin, careful. Are you the Lacombe one? I looked at her, and for the first time in 4 years, maybe longer, I smiled. Not the controlled professional expression, not the flat management face, the smile of a person who had finally, after everything, arrived somewhere that was made of real things. Yes, I said, that's me. Her eyes went red at the edges. How did you keep going when no one believed you? I thought about Doris Garreau flying through a storm at her own cost. About Dr. Asante keeping a file for 11 years because the truth doesn't expire. About Owen Mackay holding a folded printout in a vest pocket and pulling it out in the middle of a backyard party because he had decided, on his own, that at least one person's should hold the proof. You find the people who show up, I said. Not the ones who owe you, the ones who choose to. Those are the ones who count. Around the circle, people nodded. The slow, weighted nod of people who have been carrying something alone for too long and have just heard someone describe the exact shape of it. I sat back down, reached for a Timbit, ate it without ceremony. Driving home that night on the 400, windows down even though it was October and cold enough that my left hand was going numb on the wheel, I thought about my mother's house in Barrie. About the family photo that hung in her front hall, the big one from the Christmas I was 37. Petra at the center, my mother's arm around her, my nieces in matching dresses. I was on the far right, hands at my sides, no body angled toward mine. Not because I'd chosen distance. Because by the time everyone else had arranged themselves, the only space left was the one at the edge, and I had learned to stand in it without comment. I wondered if she'd moved it. I decided it didn't matter. I thought about Hargrove, who would spend the rest of his career trying to manage the paperwork trail of what he'd chosen not to escalate. About Petra, who would probably keep sending reasonable-sounding messages that subtly repositioned my clarity as my damage. About my mother, standing in my hallway with a tin of shortbread, running out of language for the first time in 41 years, all of them locked inside something of their own making. The particular kind of stuck that comes from choosing comfort over truth for so long that by the time the truth arrives, there's no framework left to hold it. But not me. I had flown into every version of that storm. The procurement crisis. The incident report. The phone call that ended without goodbye. The backyard party where 23 people laughed at the wrong thing. I had carried myself out. Not because anyone rescued me. Because I decided, somewhere around the middle of my 30s, in a community health center in northern Alberta, with 3 septic elders and a satellite phone and a bush pilot named Doris Garreau, somewhere in the dark above me, that I was worth the walk back. The highway opened up ahead of me. The October sky was doing that particular thing it does just before the temperature drops enough to mean it. Going deep and clear and almost purple at the edges, the kind of sky that makes you feel very small and very intact at the same time. I rolled the window up, turned the heat on. The quiet in the car wasn't loneliness anymore. It was the quiet of a person who had finally, after all the years and the distance and the storms, arrived at the only destination that had ever actually mattered. Not a house, not a family that had earned the word. Not a certificate on a wall or a panel chair's nod or a salute in a backyard in Barrie. Home to herself. That's the only place that was ever really hers to keep.